Brian really cared about everybody, and it sounds like a platitude, but in his case it was really true. He loved his patients, he loved his family, loved his colleagues, and they all loved him, and everybody felt that. He really cared about people.
He was a funny man. He had infinite number of jokes to tell. He loved to talk. He loved to bend your ear, and you couldn't help loving him, really.
Our offices were next door to each other, and he'd open the door, and it would be like that younger brother that's just saying, "Get away from me because I'm busy, and you're going to say something, and I'm going to laugh, and I'm going to lose track."
I can still see him striding down the hall with that ridiculous triple-headed stethoscope that used to bob around him.
Whenever he reviewed a chart, he'd get very deep in thought, and he would always do this. He would twirl his hair.
And when we drove, I was usually the driver, and then I would reach over and twirl his hair when he wasn't.
Still see him standing over the chart rack. The big smile, and it's a mischievous smile.
He used to go to Albany twice a week to help them with their hospital there, opening up an EP lab. So he's in his car, told me, speeding along, and he sees the state trooper behind him. So he says, "Oh, damn, you know." And he pulls over, and in his very Irish way, he's going to accept this speeding ticket, but he tells the officer that he's a physician and he's on the way to Albany to work in this arrhythmia lab and whatever. So I said to him, "All right, so he didn't give you the ticket." He said, "No, he gave me the ticket, but I have his mother as a referral."
The sense you get from his patients is that although lots of physicians would like to think they're irreplaceable, that he was irreplaceable.
It's like, "Come on in, John. You know, it's time for your appointment." And John go in, and I'd sit thinking, I'll just stay here. "Oh, no, you come in too."
I felt I could sit in his office forever, and it kind of implied I could if I wanted to.
He really addressed the whole patient, where the patient was in terms of their life, in terms of their disease, and made the treatment plan fit the patient to a T.
I wish the hell you'd met him. I'd say that to anybody who hasn't.
I feel sorry for anyone who didn't know him. He was just one of those people that you're blessed to have in a lifetime.
I could never describe him as being bold, but he was adventurous. And he had a gift of humour, I think, always. In fact, my gynaecologist told me that he was the only one that ever gave them a laugh in the labour room, because Patrick had arrived, and of course the next one must be a girl. The delivery was over, and Dr. Barry said, "Mrs. McGovern, you have another boy." And I said, "A boy? Are you sure?" And he said, "Well, I think I can be reasonably sure." Whereupon they all broke into laughter, so Brian gave us a laugh in the first seconds of his life.
Sutton, where our home was, is by the seaside and by a little hilly peninsula just to the north of Dublin city. It was a nice place to grow up as children. We cycled a lot, we walked a lot, we were by the sea. It was the sound of the gulls. They were happy days. Being in Brian's company was always something to look forward to. Even as a child, he had a concern for others, and he was a great brother. He was a great son.
Belvedere School is a tremendous tradition. It was founded in 1832, so it's our second oldest school, certainly in terms of continuity. Gosh, Brian really, you could describe him as a new Renaissance man. Just a person who was inquiring, and across a broad range. I know he was a brilliant cardiologist, and I know he had a specialisation, and I know he had a huge influence on the people with whom he worked, people he met and advised and so on. But just that sense in people and in the possibilities that life offered. Brian was fully alive, just fully alive.
His school reports were always academically, fine. But the remark always was a little too talkative.
Brian was a fantastic talker, and I was fairly recalcitrant. I was very shy and very quiet, so maybe we suited each other in that he did a lot of the talking. He was also a very good listener. I suppose I learned from him how important it is to talk to people and how it is better to influence people rather than to try and force them in any other way.
There was always that easy way. It was very, I can't capture it any better than, it was very nice being in Brian's company. You were sure of entertainment, you were sure of a good listener as well as a good talker, you were sure of fun and good humour.
He seems to be a person blessed with all the human gifts of wit, humour, charm. Not only was that group very bright, and Brian would have been one of the stars in it, but there was also a great sense of fun, devilment even.
An old man came in every year to take a photograph of the class. Fenton, Marr and Brian, they brought in an extra shoe. Between them, they'd slip in this extra shoe. And when the photograph was produced, well, the thing was, how many feet, how many were really in this? Simple, innocent, but they could raise a laugh even at that stage.
When we went abroad on the holidays, on the Interrail holidays, Brian had always done all the planning. He'd have a meeting with 2 or 3 of us that were travelling, and he'd say, we'll go here and we'll go there. But I mean, he brought me to see places of culture and art all over Europe, whether it was Michelangelo's statue of David, whether it was the galleries in the Louvre in Paris or in the Uffizi in Florence. Brian had a huge amount of this worked out in advance. I have no idea how he figured it all out in advance, but he brought us and he educated us in a fantastic way.
Brian loved to get in to places free or have some sort of little entree, and he investigated and found there was this thing called the Council of Europe card, which was a sort of a cultural exchange card, and this was designed to facilitate, academics visiting different countries, or filmmakers or documentary makers and stuff. And he concocted this cock and bull story that we were a group of academic filmmakers going to tour Europe looking for Irish roots and Vikings and things, and applied to the Department of Foreign Affairs it was at the time. So we went off equipped with these cards. They got us in free to various museums.
Brian liked to play golf, but he was a psychological golfer. He was very good at it himself, but the rest of us weren't.
He was very keen to try and help you miss a shot from time to time, and he had a number of techniques for doing this. One of them would be that he would say, there's a tree on the left here, but you don't need to worry about it because you'll be well right of it. And of course, every time he said that, your ball went straight to the tree. When I was 13 or 14, I had no idea what adults were thinking. Brian knew exactly how to press buttons with adults. He knew how to, I'm sure he was probably very good at making his mother annoyed at times if he chose to.
I forgot whatever misdemeanor he was guilty of. I said, I really can't cope anymore. I'm going to put you up for adoption. And his reaction was, great.
I think there's about 120 students, and they allocated your seats alphabetically. So most of my friends, I think a lot of Brian friends, would be Max, because there was a huge clump of Max right in the middle of the alphabet. We had a fantastic time there. We had lectures, we had quite a bit of free time. We used to deal with all the issues of the day and decide the future of the universe.
The thing that stood out about Brian was his sense of humour. He had a very quirky sense of humour. He had a way with words that I think was probably unmatched in our class.
He was enterprising and organising, and he liked organising trips and activities and things like that. And he brought people along with him. People said, "Oh yeah, I'll do that."
You generally knew when Brian was up to something because his step would quicken a little bit. There'd be sort of a little glint in his eye, and he sort of thrust out his chin and little steps, and you knew that there was some plan going on inside, and you knew immediately you needed to tag along here because there was going to be some fun.
Brian knew he was going to be a cardiologist fairly early, in his clinical training. I think his experiences here in the Mater, which was the National Heart Centre, convinced him that was the area that he wanted to.
The cardiologist who worked with Professor Coonahan, who was the head of the Department of Medicine at that time, and he was a very astute and bright person. It was Professor Sean Blake, who was a cardiologist in the days when echocardiography was a novelty. And the thing I particularly remember that Brian spoke about with Professor Blake was that he wrote down exactly what he was hearing with the murmur. There was none of this sort of, I think this is a mitral stenosis of such and such severity, and walking away from the bedside and saying, well, how did he come to that conclusion? The conclusion was all written down in the notes, and then you could go back as a medical student or a junior doctor, go to the patient and say, let's try it again, what did he say? And Brian would do that.
After he had spent time working in cardiac surgery and in cardiac medicine, with what were then the two professors, Owen O'Malley and Tim Coonan, who were the chairs of surgery and medicine respectively at this hospital, that it was evident that he was fascinated by cardiology.
There was a letter from Professor Coonahan in Dublin recommending Brian to us, and the letter described him in very academic terms as a remarkable individual who was obviously brilliant and had performed outstandingly well in all of his academic endeavors. And we expected a bit of an egghead, you know, the guy just looked too good on paper to be true, and in fact what we got was the opposite.
What surprised me really was, you know, that he was a very young but also at the same time a very mature man in so many ways.
He was a self-effacing, very funny, very charming individual who was obviously brilliant but didn't take himself seriously at all, and that fit in perfectly with our own view of things.
After the first year or so with us, I knew that he had a stellar career as a clinician.
The three of them were quite a trinity. It was such a strong unit because of the strength of the trio, in that they all had three quite distinct roles that merged very well together. And Brian was particularly strong with patients in the clinics.
You can build the most sophisticated laboratory with the most sophisticated equipment all you want, but without patients, there's nowhere to go. You have to educate not only the patients, but more importantly, the referring physicians. And he did that admirably.
He saw an incredible number of patients, more than any of us could ever imagine seeing, and he did it with amazing skill and humanity and optimism and humor.
Brian believed in teaching, and the more education you give to a patient, the better they're going to be able to handle their condition. So he came up with the Atrial Fibrillation Foundation, and what he wanted to do with it was to hold seminars where he educated patients. The first patient education day, we had 350 people show up, and he was in his glory. He had an entourage of people. They followed him around. It was great, it was funny, it was touching.
Brian and I were set up on a blind date by a mutual friend and colleague. He was so easy to talk to, and everybody will tell you that about Brian. He was fabulously easy to talk to. We talked about everything. We talked about medicine. We talked about our lives, our history, our backgrounds.
To be honest, when I met Anne first, I thought, oh dear, because if Brian's going to marry Anne, that means Brian ain't going to come back here. I was slightly concerned, but Anne has been a fantastic lifetime partner for Brian and hugely supportive to him, and he was extremely happy.
Brian was very lucky, very fortunate in the woman he met to be his wife. Anne is an absolutely wonderful lady, and his two daughters are two lovely children.
Yeah, the girls are really the love of his life. Or all of us are the love of his life, but he was very proud of his girls.
Every kid learns a lot from their parents and watching them and how that molds who they are as a person. One thing I definitely learned was, an avid interest in everything and in the world around me and in what people have to say. And one thing that was, particularly great about him was that he was so fun to converse with. I want to go into medicine too, so I think I, learned, an interest in science and an interest in people and in helping people to feel better, from both my parents.
It seems like medicine is really in the family because, my sister, my mom, my dad. So I was like, I really want to, and I love helping people, if they're sick. And so I was like, I really love animals, though, so I was like, I want to be a vet.
She's fantastic with animals.
Thank you.
So, she's a natural.
She's really good with kids.
I want to be a pediatrician.
He and Anne had created a marvellously united family, and they got an awful lot of fun out of the day's living. And this was because Brian and Anne, they had this lovely way of turning things into fun for the children.
He was very devoted to the field of medicine, and he was very devoted to individual patients.
I kept asking questions, and he just kept taking the time very slowly and very patiently to answer the question. I knew the first time I met him I was dealing with somebody a little different, very special.
And he would take your phone calls, that was the other thing too. So if you called him from Florida and said, this is what's going on, he would get back to you, which was amazing to me.
He would sit on the bed and he would talk to them, and it wasn't a standing over, it wasn't a, got to get moving. It was just a genuine, down to their level, eye to eye.
And I think part of what made him a great doctor was that he listened to other people's stories, and that got across to them. They felt when they had seen him that they had really been seen and heard.
He didn't always just concentrate his efforts on what their electrophysiologic problem was, but really in the context of how their cardiac problem fit into their whole life and even their family, with a tremendous amount of understanding.
People don't realize how huge amount of work this is. Every detail, to remember, make a note of every detail, respond to everybody, make sure that everybody understands everything the way they should understand.
He is the main reason for this healing garden that we have on Ellison 10. And this room was very, very drab, and he was instrumental in getting the funding for the Make a Difference grant that changed this entire room. It's just so apropos that this room is named after him, and patients can continue to come here and find peace.
Brian didn't accept authority for the sake of authority or power for the sake of power. He sometimes worked outside the system, always in a very subtle way.
Brian always was someone who had a very civilized but pretty relentless need to undermine and I think challenge authority. And he did it in very subtle ways.
The system could go along quite happily, not realising that Brian had exploited it for his own use. And that was, I think, part of the thing. He wasn't revolutionary. It's just that he achieved considerable advances while the system was still happily going along.
If you looked at the type of talks that he was asked to give at North American arrhythmia meetings, they would range all the way from sudden death in the athlete to syncope or POTS syndrome, or all the way through different drug therapies to ICD talks, tachycardias. There's no talk in the arrhythmias that Brian would not have given a wonderful talk on.
The fellows loved him because he could teach them different ways, and it was never negatively taught.
I can tell you that some very savvy fellows, you can hear them on the wards giving reports back to the referring physicians, and you can hear a little touch of Brian in their expressions and in their tones.
There are fellows out there still. One recently called from Maine and said, every time I have a difficult patient in a difficult position, I sit back and say, what would Brian do? Well, we all thought that was funny, but that was truly what this physician in Maine thought about. He said, every time it's a really difficult patient, I say, what would Brian do?
One of his patients with heart disease had gone to Buzzy's and got everything that you're not supposed to on the way to the office. And he had, from his office, seen the person, and I think he told the patient that he had heard from a higher authority that his diet had been suboptimal.
I feel markedly enriched by having known him, and still incalculably bereft at his loss.
It was one of those things that rocks you really to your core, because you don't expect people to die young or so violently and so tragically, and without any explanation.
I kept feeling that you'd wake up from a dream and find Brian on the other end of the phone saying, got you again. You know, I know that this was a bit of shock to you, but actually I'm fine. But he wasn't fine.
Brian's loss was probably about as difficult for his patients as it was for his friends.
It was very, very touching after Brian's passing. The enormous number of patients who got in touch, as were the numbers who attended Brian's funeral.
If you walk from Earlsford Terrace and then you cross the road to St. Stephen's Green, the first thing you'll notice is a statue. It is the three fates. They're basically three old women, and they've got this thread. One of them is spinning the thread, and the next is measuring the thread, and the third one of them is cutting the thread, and that's the thread of life. And I remember distinctly because Brian told me this whole statue was supposed to tell you how ephemeral life was, and at any point the thread of life could be cut by one of these fates, and you had really no control over that. And you know, when I think of Brian, I think of the three of us standing in front of that statue with him telling us what it meant, and I didn't think I'd be sort of in future years standing in front of that statue thinking, well, that's true, that's what happens.
The challenge is, and I suppose particularly for those closest, this is very difficult and it takes years, is the letting go and the forgiving.
He's missed every day by the people who know him. He's missed every day.
I've had a picture of him in my office ever since he died. I've had a fairly active relationship with the picture.
It is not uncommon for me to look at that picture of him that sits on my windowsill when I need a little inspiration and when I would like a model for myself about what it means to care for the patient.
I wouldn't be back here if it wasn't for Brian's death, because Brian's death made me take stock of what was important to me.
I think what I've learned from Brian is not to take life for granted, to appreciate the things that we all have, and try and give back in your interactions with people.
I think Brian had an impact on many people. I think his decency, his interpersonal skills, his ability to get things done.
He was the whole thing. You know, he was the consummate caregiver.
Besides having the ultimate clinical knowledge, I think his compassion to sit there and even hold someone's hand, you know, during a time when they were having a rough time, I think that probably will be what I remember most.
I think of him a lot, I really do. He was a hard guy to forget because of, you know, what he meant to me, and you know, I'm sure so many thousands of other people. He always gave you the impression that he had your best interests at heart.
Maybe that's why he became a good doctor, because he cared for people. His care was his middle name.